In a past update video I did last year, I mentioned that I wanted to bring anime as well as other types of content to the channel. And even though I mentioned some ones I wanted to talk about initially, I found myself repeatedly going back and forth on what I wanted to talk about first above all else because my thoughts tend to go all over the place. And my train of thought tends to leave and come back whenever it pleases. Plus, my gaming content was taking up most of my time. But as we started nearing the end of 2025, I started thinking and even discussing with some of my buddies about the times I spent watching anime for the first time. And that's when it hit me and I was like, wait, this is actually a sweet idea for a video. And that's pretty much what this video is, a look back at some of my earliest memories of getting into anime for the first time. I thought it'd be pretty cool to set a clear foundation of how I got into this hobby in the first place. Not only does it give you some context on where I'm coming from, but it also sets the stage for the anime content I want to bring to the channel moving forward. Plus, I know a lot of you tend to enjoy when I dive into longer form storytelling and nostalgic memories, and honestly, I live for that stuff too. To start us off, as a kid in the 2000s, cartoons were my life. And thanks to the big three of that decade being Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, and Cartoon Network, you would never see a bigger smile on my face than me hearing that final bell ring at school because I knew the second I got home, I had an entire world of fun waiting for me on that TV. That entire generation of animation was the biggest influence on me back in those days and still is to this very day. But as the years went by and we got to around 2012, that was when I slowly started to fall out of cartoons because I was 12 years old at this time and I guess I was aching for something a little different in regards to entertainment. Now around that time, back in those days where me and the dudes used to be hanging out at the computer lab playing a bunch of browser games on the internet, I kept hearing about the word anime. And before we go any further, I want to mention that while I did grow up watching stuff like Pokemon, bits and pieces of Yu-Gi-Oh, and of course Sonic X, back then I had no idea any of these counted as anime. To me, they were just more Saturday morning cartoons. But as a 12-year-old kid at this point who kept coming across all of these images of all of these characters in wallpapers from various different corners of the internet, and noticing that all of these characters were speaking in Japanese language, I was really curious on what type of world I was standing on the edge of. Like there is this massive universe just waiting to be explored. Now later that year in 2012, imagine being a kid home alone with some free time surfing through Comcast Xfinity On Demand, the service that I only started using 2 years prior to put on one of my favorite shows or movies whenever I didn't find something on live TV. And here I was thinking that this was just going to be another day of me watching something off of Disney XD On Demand or catching a free movie that they were offering that I never got to see in theaters. But instead, that day, I felt like deviating from the usual kids section I would go to and explore some of the other corners of On Demand that I never really went to before. And if I remember correctly, I think it was scrolling through the cutting edge tab was where I found Funimation. And I was like, what the hell is this? What's so fun about their animation? And that's where I found out that this was the folder that was streaming anime. And I was like, oh yeah, I did say I wanted to try this out one day. And what better day to do it than today, right? And after clicking on that anime tab, I remembered that you had two options you can select, where the first was the paid anime, where as the name suggests, in order to watch any of the shows that were on there, you'd have to pay X amount of dollars, with the other option being the free anime. If my mom found out that I made Comcast charge her monthly bills for cartoons of all things, I'd be going to sleep with a red ass. So yeah, I went with the free anime. The free tab didn't have a lot to choose from though. I think they only had up to 3 shows that you can watch at the time. And I want you to keep this in mind. At that time, there were no pictures for any of these animes whatsoever. All they gave you was a name, a description, and an episode number. So you had no way of knowing what any of these animes looked like until you started watching the episode. So basically what happened is that I went with the anime that had the most interesting name to me. And in this case for me, that was My Bride is a Mermaid. Now outside the fact that mermaids were going to be involved, I had no idea what I was getting myself into, so my expectations were pretty neutral. But when I finished that first episode of My Bride is a Mermaid, my 12-year-old mind was completely blown away from how much I loved it. Now listen, I wasn't the biggest guy when it comes to romance at the time, but I was coming off that era where I grew up watching a ton of corny romantic Disney Channel TV shows and original movies. So even as a boy, I was still pretty much open to watching romance stuff if it caught my interest. But never before was I so behind the romance between two leads in anything, because you got this likable and relatable guy, Nagasumi, who's just trying to survive his summer break. And then you've got Sun, this incredibly sweet girl who I fell for immediately because of how devoted she becomes to being Nagasumi's bride after saving him from drowning in the ocean. And from there, you watch these two get thrown into this completely insane situation and try their best to make it work. The storyline was great, the characters were charming, but honestly, the cherry on top of all of this is that the show was funny as hell. It was hilarious. I've never seen humor done in this way at all before in my life, and this was my first exposure to Japanese style humor. As soon as I finished that episode, all I wanted to do was watch more, and the way that it worked back then for Funimation On Demand is that they would have a weekly rotation of these episodes. So basically they would put out 3 episodes of an anime that you could watch, and after about a week or 2, they would add in the next 3 episodes of that particular show, while the previous 3 would get taken out. So every time I would finish an episode, I found myself eagerly waiting and anticipating the next batch of episodes every week because of how much I was enjoying the anime. And on a much deeper level, another one of the reasons I was this hooked on this medium was because I found myself really loving and appreciating Japanese culture. I just loved the way that they were presenting all of these real life and fictionalized sceneries of Japan and all the other cultures associated with it. And even though I obviously don't speak any Japanese in the slightest, I love all the opening and ending themes of the show. Even without understanding any of the lyrics, I just vibed with all the melodies to these songs. And keep in mind, I was watching these shows in English dub, and I was so attached to these characters and their voices that this was the very first time where I started paying attention to the credits so I could know who these voice actors were, which led me to remembering the names of Todd Haberkorn and Alexis Tipton. But from beginning to end, each time a new rotation of episodes would come out, I found myself there every week watching the show back to back, having an absolutely great time. And when I finished that final episode, I knew that I just found something really special. It goes without saying at this point, but I truly do believe that I couldn't have found a better anime to introduce me to this medium than My Bride is a Mermaid. And I'm really thankful for Studio Gonzo as well as everyone else who helped produce the show for that. But as soon as I finished My Bride is a Mermaid, all I had in my head was how much I wanted more of this hobby. I just wanted more anime to watch. And after they finished that last cycle of episodes, that's when I started rolling out episodes of this new show called Rosario Vampire. So I dove right in. And if there's one thing I immediately noticed as soon as I started watching that first episode and hearing these characters talk, I was like, Nagasumi? Son? Like, what are the odds? My second anime had the same 2 voice actors from my first one, and they were the main couple again? I was like, dude, was it actually my destiny to watch this anime right after Mermaid? Insane coincidence, but when it comes to the actual show itself, just like with My Bride is a Mermaid, I really loved it. And I was head over heels for Mocha Akashiya, both versions of her. Yeah, my crush on her was so huge, it was practically a chokehold with how sweet her personality was and her wholesome relationship with Skune. And the same goes with Inner Mocha, with how she dominates all of the battles that she's in. The show had a really great story and a cast of characters that I really liked as well, but if I'm gonna be honest, I'd say the biggest significance of this show for me at the time was the fact that this was the very first anime where I was introduced to, fan service. Or more specifically, fan service of the ecchi and harem kind. And man, did that warp my 12-year-old mind, because seeing the amount of panty shots and breast zoom-ins in this show, let's just say, enhanced my experience both upstairs and especially downstairs. But in all seriousness, Rosario Vampire was a really fun show that has a lot of heart to it that I happily and excitingly watched every week. Which, by the way, during my later years in high school, I actually started reading the manga of Rosario Vampire, and holy crap, it's fantastic. Like, no joke, the storyline is incredible in the manga, and I ended up loving that 100 times more than the actual anime itself. I totally recommend it to anyone who's big into manga. But as you guys are noticing the pattern, a lot of my early days watching anime was through week-to-week tune-ins on Funimation On Demand. So yeah, when Rosario Vampire finished and they started rolling out the next batch of episodes for the next anime, that's when I saw this one called Sekirei. And listen, as an early teenage boy at this point, I clearly had a type when it comes to the anime I want to see. But the biggest thing I remember from this anime that struck my hormones like lightning is the fact that this was the very first piece of animation I ever saw that showed me an uncensored female breast. Nipples out and everything. I had 2 reactions to this. The first being the need of a new zipper. The second being this horrifying, alarming fear throughout my body of making damn sure that no one else was in the living room with me. Because getting caught watching this type of content on TV as a kid, I might as well be put in front of a firing squad. But putting that aside, despite how insane the fan service elements in the show were, the storyline was so good. And the fight scenes, they were surprisingly awesome to watch and had a lot of emotion in a lot of them. And the characters, of course I had crushes on nearly all of the chicks. But even taking that aside, it was the writing that made all of them as a cast just so charming and lovable. I was so engaged with Sekirei that I remembered getting so mad when I finished the last episode of season 2 and found out that they left it on a cliffhanger, because the characters were on this really exciting mission and I wanted to see how it was all going to go down, and it's frustrating that they never made a season 3. I actually got the first 2 volumes of the manga relatively recently because I just couldn't wait anymore to see how this whole story was going to conclude. But putting that aside, I really loved everything about Sekirei. It was such a great show. And things went from 0 to 100 real quick once they started rolling out episodes for the next anime, because for me, that was Strike Witches. And man, if Sekirei didn't break me, it was definitely this anime. This show has the craziest concept ever, and the best concept ever. Because once I found out that this show was about girls in the military flying in the air, gunning down aliens, while wearing no pants, I completely lost it. And despite how insane the idea of this show is, it surprisingly is still a fun show to watch. It was at this point where I realized that there is nothing anime can't do. Because regardless of how ridiculous these ideas are, they still found a way to add character development and heart to these shows, which is exactly what Strike Witches did. Not to mention, the actual flight scenes whenever the girls are on their striker jets are surprisingly breathtaking. The animation is truly a spectacle. There's definitely a sense of freedom when you see them soaring through the air, which helps makes the battle scenes more visually impressive. So as much as I enjoyed the fan service, and I mean really enjoyed the fan service, the show itself was still really fun for what it was. But of course we gotta keep this train going along with some more slice of life rom-coms, because I do remember one of the next shows they started putting out was this one called Be Gata HK. This show is about a girl with a goal of wanting to lay down with 100 guys. That alone should tell you how raunchy the comedy in this show is. But even with all of that, the show manages to have a really charming and entertaining romance between the main girl and guy. Definitely can't miss this one if you're a fan of rom-coms. It wouldn't take a sidekick to tell that at this point in my life, I had a huge craving for fan service in my anime. So much so that I almost didn't even continue watching this next anime. When they started rolling out the episodes for this anime called Shiki, I was hoping for the same levels of fan service I was seeing in these previous shows. But once I saw that they weren't doing that with this show, I was thinking of dropping it. Yet for some reason, I found myself still coming back every week to watch all of the episodes. And the reason why is because the storyline was so good, it was addicting. Because you have all of these people in this village all suddenly dying one after another and no one knows how it's happening. And seeing the main character, who's a doctor, trying to figure all of this out while you also have vampires coming into the mix had my eyes glued to the screen. This was my first foray into thriller and mystery genre anime, and I couldn't think of a better introduction than this. Love Shiki. But after that, the next show was Heaven's Lost Property. And dude, this is another one of my favorite rom-coms out there because it's hilarious on every level. Of course, I was barking like a wild mutt every time Icarus was on screen because of 2 very good reasons. But the emotional development she had in the show had so much heart to it. And I still remember when Icarus was one of the most popular anime girls of that era. But the craziest part is, the one who stands out the most to me isn't even her. It's Tomoki, the main protagonist. He's easily one of the funniest protagonists I've ever seen in an anime. I love how this guy wears being a pervert as a glorious badge of honor in this show. It's so amazing. It's a really great show and one of the best of the early 2010s era. And of course, there were a couple of other shows I was getting into as well, like A Certain Magical Index, a show that gave me my favorite female character in anime, and Shangri-La. The point is that I owe a lot to Funimation On Demand because it was the bridge that introduced me to the world of anime. And it doesn't even stop there, because I was still in middle school at this time and I remembered watching Nicktoons every day in the evenings. So alongside all of my favorite Nickelodeon cartoons growing up, this was around the time they started airing a bunch of anime on there. So as I was on my 4th rewatch of Avatar: The Last Airbender, right afterwards would be an episode of Dragon Ball Z Kai. And this is how I got into the entire Dragon Ball series. Loved the hell out of the show, and I remembered being on the edge of my seat throughout the entirety of the Frieza and Cell saga. And they were also airing the original Yu-Gi-Oh on there. Same with Yu-Gi-Oh! Zexal because that was new at the time. But dude, that Duelist Kingdom arc made me a Yu-Gi-Oh! Fan for life. And it taught me how to properly play the card game at that time too. And what also threw me out of the loop is that they were even airing the original Digimon on there. And I was like, alright, cool. Because you need to understand, while I do have some memories of Toonami, I didn't really grow up watching it because around 2006-ish, they started moving that block too late at night. me being a 6-year-old kid at the time, I obviously couldn't stay up and watch it because I had a bedtime. So in essence, the early 2010s era of Nicktoons was my Toonami, and I'm always going to miss that era because of that. It was just so awesome. And when it comes to Cartoon Network, I didn't get to watch any of the Bakugans or Beyblades that were on there, and I wish I did. But when Tenkai Knights started airing on Saturday mornings, I was hooked. The biggest reasoning being is that show has a lot of what I loved about Code Lyoko growing up. And that alone gets my golden seal of approval because that show's awesome. But Tenkai Knights itself was so cool, and it was one of my earliest experiences watching mecha type anime. But as time went on that year, I started to phase out of cable television and got more into streaming. And once my family got a Netflix subscription for the first time and I saw that there was anime on there, suddenly my homework flew into the stratosphere and I spent my entire afternoons and evenings watching Fairy Tail, a little fantasy battle shonen with fan service aplenty and kick-ass fight scenes. Yeah dude, Fairy Tail was insanely fun to watch back in those days. It's got that my friends are my power cliche, but honestly I never minded it because the entire cast of characters in the Fairy Tail Guild are honestly some of the coolest bunch you'll ever see. In fact, I remember being so frustrated because Netflix didn't have all the episodes of Fairy Tail at the time. I think it stopped after the 50 episode mark if I remember correctly. So once I got to that point, I was kinda bummed, but luckily that was around the same time I got my first smartphone. So I was able to continue watching the show on there through some funny websites I found. If you know, you know. And that's also how I started getting into stuff like Naruto for the first time, then Bleach right afterwards. Love both of those shows to death. And One Piece, the show I was too intimidated to get into back in those days because of the absurd amount of episodes it has. I dove right in at around 2014. And to this day, I've never seen another anime that was that addicting on a nearly dangerous level. I remember watching 10 episodes per day of One Piece from the very start all the way to the end of the pre-time skip, and it was one of the best experiences I've ever had watching anime. And I also remember around this time I was also huge into Roblox, and one of the animes that was super popular with a lot of the game creators on there was Sword Art Online, which was also simultaneously airing on Toonami at the time, so I started watching that and enjoying it. And it was pretty much my first isekai anime. I even remembered when Akame Ga Kill first got big when it came out. It pulled absolutely no punches when it comes to its characters and fight scenes, and that show was one of the biggest talks of middle school between me and my buddies at the time. And there's so many more shows on my mind I could talk about, like my entire journey watching Katekyo Hitman Reborn, Hunter x Hunter, Kill la Kill, Shaman King, and World Trigger, all of which are anime I love to death. And I'd love to go into them in their own separate videos. But what this all boils down to is that this whole era of the 2010s was the absolute peak of me experiencing Japan's national treasure of anime. And it became a medium I grew to love and cherish just as much as video games. As I eventually got to high school and up to now with my life, I haven't watched as much anime as I used to, but there's still plenty of amazing shows out there that I discovered throughout the years, and even now that still gave me that same spark that reminded me why I fell in love with this medium. It truly is an incredible product that I couldn't be any more thankful for having the chance to experience thanks to the amazing creators over in Japan. And regardless of how big anime gets over here in the West, I wouldn't want to see it change for the world. All the quirks, all the weirdness, and all the crazy things that make anime what it is exactly why I fell in love with the medium. The product is beautiful as is and will continue to thrive as is. And with all that being said, this was my story of how I got into anime. I'm always going to look back on these memories fondly while also proudly looking forward to the future of what this medium has to offer next. Thank you guys so much for watching and have yourselves a great day. Laters.